They said I was disrupting their life, that my old woman's habits ruined the mood, clashed with their kitchen aesthetic, and threw off their rhythm. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply agreed, quietly, to move out. A week later, my kind relatives received an official letter and a visit from the police. They hadn't noticed I'd already removed their nameplate from the door. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Helen Watson. I was 69 years old, retired, and living in the house I had shared with my late husband for over 4 decades. Before retirement, I worked as a pharmacist in a private clinic in Ohio. For most of my life, I followed routines, served others, saved for the future, and tried not to make noise when I suffered. My days had once been filled with people who needed me, patients, co-workers, neighbors. But as the years passed, that circle shrank. Eventually, it was just family. My husband, Richard, had passed away from heart failure 6 years earlier. His death was quiet, like everything about him. We buried him under the oak tree he planted in the backyard. After that, the house felt enormous. The silence echoed differently when you were the only one left to hear it. But I stayed. I couldn't leave the place where every creak of the floorboards held a memory, where my son's height was still marked in pencil on the kitchen doorway. My son, Andrew, had grown up in this house. He ran through these halls with scraped knees and cereal-stained pajamas. When he brought home his girlfriend, Jenna, I welcomed her as best I could. They married young and lived in a small apartment until the twins came. It was Jenna who first suggested they move in with me. "Just for a while," she said. I didn't argue. I offered them the upstairs rooms and turned the den into a playroom for the kids. I cleared out closets, bought new towels, made space where I once stored my husband's books. The first year was warm, chaotic, full of new routines. I cooked dinners, picked up toys, and walked the twins to preschool when Jenna had interviews. I didn't mind. It felt good to be needed again. I gave up more space in the house without thinking, relinquished the garage, gave them the master bedroom, and moved myself into the smallest room on the first floor. "It's easier for me with the stairs," I told them, even though my knees were fine. Holidays were crowded but joyful. I hung stockings for everyone, roasted turkeys, wrapped presents late at night. Sometimes I caught myself smiling at the noise, the life that had returned to the rooms. I thought I was part of something, a pillar still holding this family together. But over time, subtle changes crept in, like frost across a window pane, quiet but persistent. Little things went missing. My garden chairs were replaced with minimalist metal ones. My old mugs vanished from the shelf, replaced with white ceramic sets. The floral curtains I had sewn myself were suddenly too dated and came down without warning. I didn't ask where they went. I tried to believe they'd been washed or stored, but I knew. I started to hear whispers when I walked into the kitchen, pauses in conversation, quick glances between them. Jenna had begun calling the house our place when speaking with friends. She gave tours to her co-workers like it was hers to show off. She changed the Wi-Fi name to Watson Nest and smiled like it was a clever family joke. I laughed along, but inside something shifted. I wasn't blind. I saw how Jenna flinched when I offered parenting advice, how Andrew stopped asking about my day. He used to bring me tea in the evenings and sit on the porch with me. Lately, he only came down for food or to pick up the kids. Sometimes I went entire days without hearing more than a good morning from either of them. I began to wonder if I was still part of their equation, or just an outdated variable they were too polite to erase. I clung to memories in the quiet hours. My wedding dress still hung in the back of the hall closet, yellowing softly with time. The kitchen still held a faint smell of the lemon pies Richard used to love. I sat on the porch swing, listening to the creak of the chain and the wind stirring the leaves. I told myself this was still my home. But even the walls felt like they were waiting to forget me. The twins grew fast. They stopped asking for bedtime stories. They played in their room with the door closed, eyes glued to screens. Jenna once told them to call me Nana Helen instead of just Nana because she said it sounded more distinguished. I didn't argue. I let the little things slide until the little things piled up like snow, until I couldn't open the front door without feeling buried by cold politeness. I didn't have many friends left. Most of the people I knew were either gone or fading like I was. My phone barely rang unless it was a doctor's office. I made grocery lists more detailed than conversations. Sometimes I cooked dinner just to have something warm in the house, even if no one ate it but me. I started writing in a journal again, like I had when I was a girl. Except now I wasn't dreaming. I was trying not to disappear. I had once believed family meant safety, permanence, legacy, but I began to see that family could also mean compromise, erosion, and silence. I wasn't angry, not yet. I just felt like a book left on the wrong shelf, still filled with stories, but unread, collecting dust, waiting for someone to remember it was there. There was a shift in the air long before words were spoken. It came quietly, like a draft under the door, barely felt at first, but slowly growing colder over time. I began to sense it in the way Jenna moved around me in the kitchen, careful not to brush my arm, avoiding eye contact as if my presence was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Andrew, my son, was always somewhere else, at work, in the garage, running errands. I didn't take it personally at first. Life was busy, and I told myself they were simply tired. But tired people still say thank you. Tired people still smile. Small things changed. My morning routine of putting on a pot of coffee was interrupted when I noticed Jenna had already made hers using a new French press she ordered online. My old drip machine was moved to the garage. My favorite mug disappeared. In its place were matching white cups that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The pantry I had stocked for years was reorganized without my input. Canned goods I had bought were donated without asking. They began replacing things, my towels, my rugs, my dishes, as if the house itself needed a makeover, and I was part of the clutter. They didn't say I was in the way, but they didn't need to. I became more careful, more quiet. I started stepping aside when Jenna came down the hallway, even if there was plenty of room. I waited for everyone to leave the kitchen before making my tea. I took to eating in my room with the door closed, not out of resentment, but out of instinct. I didn't want to disturb their space, even though it had once been mine. The twins, once glued to my side, now barely looked up when I entered the room. They were busy with their screens, their friends, their routines. I wasn't angry at them. Children follow the energy around them, and the energy said I was background noise. I became the person who reminded them to put on jackets, who folded their socks, who asked too many questions. I stopped asking. I simply watched. Jenna took over the garden. She hired landscapers to remove what she called the overgrown shrubs. Those shrubs had been planted by Richard and me our first year in the house. She replaced them with something minimal, sterile, pretty, but heartless. I didn't protest. I sat in the sunroom and listened to the buzz of hedge trimmers cutting through memory. I began to realize that I was being managed, not included, not embraced, managed. Suggestions about senior activities began to appear in casual conversation. Flyers for community centers mysteriously landed on my nightstand. Jenna once left a brochure about independent senior living on the counter. She never mentioned it, neither did I. But the message was clear. They were building a life that didn't include me, and they wanted me to quietly accept that fact. Every object in the house seemed to confirm it. The family photos on the mantel had shifted. Images of my son and his family took center stage. My wedding photo was moved to a lower shelf. My handmade quilt was replaced by a machine-stitched throw. The piano that once filled the living room with music sat silent, used now as a decorative surface for candles. I found myself apologizing for existing, for coughing too loudly, for forgetting to buy oat milk, for taking too long in the shower. I measured my footsteps. I tried to become invisible, but invisibility isn't peaceful. It's suffocating. It wraps around you like a fog, and after a while, you forget the sound of your own voice. The day I truly understood how far I had fallen out of place came on a Saturday. Jenna was hosting a small gathering for her co-workers. I helped tidy the house, set the table, even baked a pie. But when the guests arrived, she introduced the house as theirs. She didn't mention me. She didn't invite me to sit. I stood by the kitchen door, listening to laughter float from the living room like it came from another world. I wasn't part of it. I wasn't even near it. After the guests left, I cleaned up alone. Plates stacked, glasses rinsed, counters wiped down. No one asked for help. No one thanked me. It was as if I wasn't even there. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to recall the last time I had felt seen, truly seen, as a person and not a fixture. I couldn't remember. I was beginning to understand something painful. You can live in a house and still be a stranger in it. You can raise a child and still be treated like a burden. You can give everything, and it still won't be enough for those who want you gone, not in cruelty, but in quiet dismissal. I was a shadow in my own story, and even shadows need light to exist. It began, as these things often do, with kindness wrapped around calculation. The way Jenna spoke to me shifted. Less tension, more gentleness. Her voice became overly soft, and her sentences trailed with comforting phrases, like she was cushioning something sharp. She started leaving little suggestions again, articles printed from the internet, helpful advice columns about aging gracefully, downsizing, simplifying one's life. I found them on the kitchen counter, on my dresser, even once tucked into the folded towel in the bathroom. Andrew was quieter than usual, but he seemed on edge, as if he was rehearsing something in his mind every time he saw me. He lingered in the hallways. He avoided long eye contact. He patted my shoulder more often, like someone handling a fragile package. And still, they said nothing. Until one morning, I found them sitting at the dining table with coffee, and that fixed, earnest expression people wear when they're about to hurt you and want to look like they're not. Jenna began with compliments. She talked about how much I had done for the family, how grateful they were, how amazing it had been to have 3 generations under one roof. Then came the turn. She spoke of change, of new opportunities, of how much I deserved comfort and rest, how I needed space, quiet, community. She said the word independence so many times, I almost believed I had lost mine without realizing it. The idea was simple, she claimed. A beautiful senior living apartment, modern, close to shops, with people my age, activities, shuttle buses to the library. A place where you wouldn't feel like a guest, she said. I suppose she didn't hear the weight of those words. Or maybe she did. They had already researched it, of course, printed brochures, Photos of smiling women on porches with knitting in their laps, clean rooms with generic art on the walls. The rent, Jenna assured me, was within budget. They would help with the transition. "We'll be right here if you ever need anything," she said, as if I didn't live in the same house already. I nodded slowly. I didn't ask who "we" was. I didn't mention the decades I had spent in this house, laying tile in the kitchen with Richard, repairing the fence during storms, planting trees in the backyard that now shaded their brunches. I didn't remind them that the very walls of this house knew my voice better than theirs. Instead, I asked to think about it. They smiled, relieved, mistaking my calm for agreement. Jenna began talking about timelines, movers, how they'd help pack. Andrew tried to sound upbeat, but I could hear the guilt curled beneath his tone. Still, he didn't stop it. He didn't question her. He didn't look at me like a son. He looked at me like a man completing a difficult task. I spent the next few days walking through the house like a visitor in a museum. Every room held layers of memory pressed into its surfaces. The way the stairs creaked on the third step, the corner of the living room where Richard had fallen asleep during every holiday movie, the outline of the clock that used to hang in the hallway, now replaced by abstract art Jenna found online. I wasn't nostalgic. I was scanning a battlefield, marking what I would take, what I would leave behind, and what I would bury so no one else could claim it. I visited a lawyer. His office was in a small red brick building downtown, filled with aging books and the smell of dust and tobacco. He listened carefully without interrupting. He didn't look surprised. I signed papers, asked questions, signed more. I asked him to draft a listing for a private sale. I didn't want the house going to just anyone. I already had someone in mind. The neighbor 3 houses down, Grace, had been a widow for 10 years. Her nephew, Dean, was a quiet man in his 30s who worked in real estate and owed me a favor. Years ago, I helped him pay for medicine when his insurance fell through. I hadn't expected repayment. But when I mentioned my situation, his eyes narrowed and he said he had just the plan. We arranged everything discreetly. A simple sale, clean paperwork, a transfer through a private buyer. No signs, no open houses. I was technically the seller, but the name on the purchase agreement belonged to a small LLC Dean had set up years ago. It was untraceable on the surface, just another quiet transaction in a quiet neighborhood. But the house would go to people who respected what it was, people who would treat it like a home, not a showroom. I didn't tell Andrew or Jenna. I let them keep talking about apartments, about paint swatches and moving dates. I smiled and asked questions. I let them believe I was cooperating. It wasn't hard. They were so eager to erase me that they never noticed I was writing my own ending. On the day I signed the final papers, I walked through each room one last time. I touched the walls. I whispered Richard's name. I folded my sweaters, packed my books, left the casserole dishes and the china set they never used. I made my bed with crisp corners and left the window slightly cracked, just as I had done every morning for 40 years. When I handed the keys to Dean, I didn't feel sadness. I felt clarity. There was no longer a place here for the woman I had been. But there would be consequences for forgetting that she built everything. It happened quickly. Real estate deals always seem slow from the outside. Weeks of waiting, mountains of paperwork. But once everything aligns, the final steps move like a falling domino. One day, I was watching birds in the backyard with a cup of tea. And the next, I was no longer the legal owner of the house I had lived in for most of my adult life. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like an unburdening. Dean handled everything with precision. He sent over the final documents with a small note attached. All done. They're yours now. I didn't need the confirmation, but I appreciated the simplicity. The buyer, on paper, was a faceless entity. In reality, it was a family I had quietly watched over for years. They were kind, quiet, respectful people. Grace's niece and her husband. She had told me they'd been looking for a place to settle, to raise their children, to create something lasting. I didn't tell her my plans right away. I waited until it was done, and then I let her know that her family now owned the White House on the corner, the one with the hydrangeas I planted in 1987. I packed my bags in silence. Not much, just the essentials. 2 suitcases of clothes, some photo albums, my late husband's watch, a few recipe cards written in my mother's cursive. I didn't take furniture. I didn't take anything that anchored me to the place physically. Everything that truly mattered I carried in memory. The rest would be dealt with later by someone else, or maybe not at all. Andrew helped me carry the bags to the car. His eyes darted around, uncertain. I could tell he wanted to ask questions but wasn't sure what to say. I smiled and thanked him. He opened the door for me like a polite stranger. I almost told him everything in that moment. Almost. But I held it. Some truths are meant to arrive on their own schedule. The apartment I moved into was small, clean, and quiet. A second-floor unit in a modest complex not far from downtown. The rent was low, the neighbors were invisible, and the windows faced east, flooding the living room with light each morning. I arranged my things simply. No clutter, no noise, no reminders of the life I had left behind. Just peace. For the first few days, I slept deeply, like a person who had finally stopped holding her breath. I walked through the park, visited the library, and cooked small meals just for myself. No one moved my things. No one made me feel unwelcome in my own space. The silence, for once, was mine to enjoy. Meanwhile, back at the house, the clock began ticking. Dean had given Andrew and Jenna a courtesy buffer, 7 days before official contact. I didn't ask for that, but I understood the reasoning. Let them settle into the illusion. Let them believe they were orchestrating the transition. Let them hang their new curtains, buy matching organizers, and plan their renovations. On the 7th day, the letter was delivered. A simple formal notification of ownership transfer. Enclosed were copies of the deed, a new title, and a request to vacate the property within 5 business days. It was written in legal language, neutral and firm, but behind every sentence was the truth they would not see coming. Dean told me later how it went. Jenna opened the letter first. She didn't understand it. She thought it was a scam. Andrew called the number listed on the document, demanding answers. Dean answered calmly, professionally, and confirmed everything. The name on the deed was legitimate. The purchase had been processed, notarized, and filed with the county. The house was no longer theirs, and it hadn't been mine for over a week. I imagined their faces, confusion slipping into disbelief, then into panic. The silence around the dinner table, the flurry of phone calls, the desperate search for explanations. I wondered if they looked for me, if they thought I had been tricked, if they still believed I was fragile and naive. That's the problem with being underestimated for too long. Eventually, people forget you were ever capable of more. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't respond to the emails. I simply watched the weather change outside my new window and felt the weight of years sliding off my shoulders. Grace told me the family planned to move in soon. They had 2 children, both under 10, and were excited to have a yard. They wanted to paint the living room a warm yellow, like the house Grace and I both grew up in. They would keep the porch swing. They would fix the attic window, that had always stuck in the summer. They said they felt like the house had a story and they wanted to be part of it. That made me smile. Not a bitter smile, not the smile of revenge, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the home I built would finally be loved again, not as a stage for someone else's life, but as a home in its own right. They were the new owners now, and I was no longer a ghost in my own story. I was, at last, free. The morning it all unfolded, I was sitting by the window in my small apartment, watching the light filter through the lace curtains I had hung myself. The world felt calm, indifferent. Birds moved between branches outside. Somewhere, a lawnmower hummed. I drank my tea slowly, knowing that within the hour the house I used to call home would become a battlefield, and I would not be on it. The letter arrived by certified mail, delivered with precision by a process server hired through Dean's office. It bore an official seal and multiple pages of legal print. It was not aggressive in tone. It didn't need to be. The facts were simple and final. The property had been legally sold and transferred. The current occupants were now considered unlawful residents. They were given 5 business days to vacate the premises or face further legal action, including forced eviction with police supervision. Dean had drafted the language carefully. There was no room for emotion, only clauses, subsections, statutes. The law moved with cold efficiency when used properly. I had learned that lesson late in life, but I had learned it well. I imagined Jenna opening the letter, sitting at the kitchen table where I had once peeled apples and folded napkins, her perfectly manicured fingers sliding over the envelope, her brow tightening as she tried to understand what she was reading. I pictured Andrew pacing behind her, reading over her shoulder, disbelief spreading across his face like spilled ink. I could see it all without needing to be there. When Dean called to confirm delivery, he told me there had been yelling on the other end of the phone, accusations, confusion. Jenna had insisted there must be a mistake. Andrew had asked who signed the documents. Dean simply told them the truth. The seller had been Helen Watson. No mistake, no forgery. Everything had been done according to the letter of the law. What stung them most, I believe, wasn't the legality. It was the stealth. The fact that I had carried out a full transaction under their noses, with poise and silence. They had spent so much time ignoring me that they had failed to notice the most important move of all. Their oversight was complete. That day, the house became something else in their eyes. It was no longer a backdrop for their lives. It became unfamiliar, uncertain, hostile. The walls they had taken for granted turned cold. The rooms they had claimed as theirs were no longer under their name. I imagined them standing in the hallway, feeling it for the first time. The absence of power, that heavy, bitter taste of not being in control. They tried to reach me, of course. Calls flooded in. First polite, then frantic, then furious. Voicemail stacked up. Apologies laced with desperation. Demands disguised as concern. I didn't answer. I didn't listen to most of them. But one message I played twice. It was Andrew. His voice was tight, strained. He asked me why. He said he didn't understand. And in that moment, I knew he truly didn't. He didn't understand what it meant to feel erased inside your own home. He didn't understand what it was to walk through rooms you paid for, built with your own hands, only to be treated like a squatter. He had forgotten the smell of cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning, the time I stayed up with him through fevers, the day I taught him to tie his shoes in the front hallway. He didn't see me anymore. He saw a shadow, a weight, a complication, and I had let them believe it until I didn't. Dean coordinated the next step. A second notice, this time from local authorities, confirmed that enforcement would proceed if the house was not vacated by the stated date. The buyers had the right to immediate possession. The clock was now ticking in their ears, loud and undeniable. Grace told me she saw them outside that afternoon, speaking with a police officer. Nothing dramatic, just protocol. But their faces were pale, tight with worry. Jenna's hands moved rapidly as she spoke, her voice rising in tone even though her words weren't audible from the street. The twins stood behind her, confused, clutching their backpacks. I felt a twinge then, not regret, not sorrow, just the familiar ache of reality. Children suffer the fallout of their parents' choices, but children also adapt. And maybe one day they would learn that kindness withheld has consequences. That silence does not mean weakness, that a person who goes unseen for long enough eventually disappears and takes everything with her. I didn't celebrate, I didn't toast or gloat or smile at their downfall. I sat quietly, knitting a scarf, the television on low, the apartment warm. I felt something inside me realign, like a bone set properly after years out of place. The pain was still there, yes, but it was cleaner now, sharper, honest. The eviction was not yet final, but the outcome was inevitable. They would leave, they would move, scramble, fight, or surrender. But they would no longer live inside a story that didn't belong to them. They had tried to write me out. I had simply edited the ending, and when it arrived in the form of a stamped letter in a government envelope, it carried more weight than any argument, any plea, any cry of protest. It was the sound of a door closing, of ownership redefined, of silence, loud and lawful, having the final word. I knew he would come. Maybe not that day, maybe not even that week, but I knew eventually Andrew would stand in front of me with a face full of questions he didn't know how to ask. He was my son, after all. Despite the distance, the silence, the years of growing apart, he still carried the echo of a child who once ran into my arms when things didn't make sense. That child was gone now, but fragments of him remained in the way he knocked, softly, as if hoping I wouldn't answer. I opened the door slowly. He stood there, looking older than I remembered. Not just tired, worn. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his eyes held that searching expression that children wear when the world slips out of their control. He wasn't angry anymore. That fire had burned out. What remained was something closer to disbelief, maybe even guilt, but wrapped in confusion. He stepped into the apartment without waiting to be invited, glancing around like he was trying to understand where I had gone, as if this space could explain what the house no longer would. He sat down at the table like it was still his place to do so. I sat across from him. The table between us felt wider than it should have. For a long while, he said nothing. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked everywhere except at me. And then the questions began. Not about the legalities. Those had already been answered. Not about the money. He knew better than to ask. He asked why. He asked how. He asked what he had done that was so wrong, so unforgivable. I let the words settle in the air before responding. I didn't yell. I didn't list grievances like a lawyer in court. I spoke plainly, carefully, without bitterness. I told him what it felt like to be erased, piece by piece, until I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. I told him how silence replaced gratitude, how space replaced closeness, how my own home became unfamiliar because of how I was treated inside it. I reminded him that absence doesn't always mean someone left. It sometimes means they were pushed out, slowly, invisibly. He tried to defend himself. He talked about work, stress, children, timing. He said they never meant to hurt me. I believed him. I really did. But intentions mean little when the results are this loud. I had spent years excusing actions because they weren't deliberate. I had explained away neglect as distraction, coldness as exhaustion, indifference as busyness. But after a while, what people mean matters far less than what they do. He asked if there was any way to fix it. I said some things are not meant to be fixed, only learned from. That seemed to hurt more than anything else I said. He looked like someone who had come expecting punishment and instead found a locked door. There was no rage in me anymore, no vengeance, no lecture, just a simple boundary he never thought I would draw. He looked around the room again, noticing things for the first time. The stack of library books, the knitted shawl on the back of the chair, the photo of Richard and me on the dresser. These things weren't grand or angry. They were small, calm, and completely mine. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that I was no longer waiting for a place in their life. I had built one of my own. He stood up finally and walked toward the door. He turned back just for a moment and asked if I would ever come back. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw both the boy I raised and the man who forgot I was more than a convenience. I told him that coming back isn't about geography. It's about being seen, respected, invited in, not tolerated. And that invitation had long since expired. He nodded slowly. There were no tears, no dramatic exit, just the sound of the door closing behind him and the quiet that followed. A quiet that didn't feel lonely this time. It felt earned. That was the last time I saw him in person. He sent messages after that, updates, apologies, small efforts to reconnect. I read them. Sometimes I even replied. But the relationship had changed. I wasn't angry. I had simply stepped off a path I had walked too long with bleeding feet. And once you stop the bleeding, you don't put the shoes back on. The conversation stayed with me, not as a wound, but as a marker. A final chapter in the part of my life that revolved around waiting, waiting to be seen, to be appreciated, to matter. That wait was over. In its place stood something stronger, my own voice, my own space, and a life that no longer asked me to be smaller just to keep the peace. After he left, the silence returned. But this time it was not heavy or suffocating. It was mine. It filled the apartment not with absence, but with clarity. There were no footsteps overhead, no hushed voices behind closed doors, no reminders that I had overstayed a welcome I was never really offered. For the first time in years, I wasn't navigating someone else's moods or adjusting myself to fit into a space that had shrunk around me. I was simply existing, fully, quietly, entirely. In the days that followed, I found myself settling into a rhythm I hadn't realized I was craving. The mornings were slow and soft. I would rise without an alarm, boil water for tea, and sit by the window as the light poured in. I stopped rushing through meals. I cooked what I liked, simple things, familiar things. I played music out loud, humming along without fear of disrupting anyone else's atmosphere. I kept the television on when I wanted company and turned it off when I wanted peace. No one sighed. No one adjusted the volume. The room adapted to me. I rearranged my furniture, not out of necessity, but as a gesture of ownership. The small bookshelf now sat under the window, filled with novels I had been meaning to reread. I moved the armchair closer to the balcony, where the afternoon sun warmed the fabric. I bought myself a new lamp. Nothing fancy, just something soft and golden that reminded me of autumn. Everything in the apartment reflected my taste, my needs, my comfort. For the first time in decades, I didn't compromise on where to hang a picture or what color to put on the walls. The air felt different, lighter. I could breathe without tension. I could speak without being corrected. I could move through a space that welcomed me instead of shrinking from me. It wasn't just about leaving a house. It was about reclaiming the right to exist without apology. Occasionally, I walked past the old house, not by design, just part of my route to the market or the post office. I never lingered, never stared, but I saw it, and what I saw didn't hurt. The porch swing was still there, gently swaying in the breeze. The hydrangeas had started to bloom again. New curtains hung in the front window, and a child's bike leaned against the porch railing. It no longer looked like my house, and that was a relief. I had left, yes, but I hadn't vanished. I had transformed. And in that transformation, I had made space for others. The new family was settling in. Grace told me her niece loved the kitchen, that they had repainted the walls a warm yellow and were planning to plant vegetables in the garden beds I once tended. They didn't erase what was there. They built on it. That mattered to me more than I expected. I received a letter from one of the children, an actual handwritten letter with crooked spelling and big looping letters. It thanked me for the yard and said the big tree in the back was perfect for climbing. It sat on my kitchen table for days before I put it in a drawer, folded gently next to a photo of Richard and me on our anniversary. I didn't need to frame it. Just knowing it was there was enough. Sometimes I thought about the life I left behind, the years spent bending, accommodating, offering myself in pieces to people who never thought to give anything back. I didn't feel resentment, just a quiet understanding that survival sometimes requires retreat. That freedom often starts with a door you close gently behind you, without ceremony or farewell. There was no one checking on me daily, no one texting to ask if I was okay. And yet I didn't feel lonely. I felt intact, whole, free of the subtle expectations that had weighed on me for so long. I made my bed each morning, not because someone would see it, but because it pleased me. I took walks without needing to justify them. I sat in cafes with a book and lingered as long as I wanted. I began writing again. Nothing elaborate, just short observations, moments captured in ink. I wrote about the sound of rain on the roof, the scent of rosemary in the park, the way a stranger held the door for me without rushing. I filled page after page without an audience, without a goal, just to remember that I had thoughts worth holding on to. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I was simply living in a space that no longer questioned my right to be there. That was the true gift of leaving. Not revenge, not justice, not even peace. It was spaciousness, room to expand, to breathe, to exist without reduction, a life reclaimed in small, deliberate ways. And within that reclaimed life, I discovered something I had forgotten how to feel. Enough. I was enough, and I didn't need anyone's permission to believe it. It always started the same way. The sharp buzz of my phone, the soft glow of the screen lighting up in my quiet apartment. I didn't keep the ringer on anymore. I preferred the peace, but even the vibration felt louder than it should have in my space. I would glance over, already knowing what I would see before the letters came into focus. His name, Andrew, not unknown, not no caller ID, just him. Clean, simple, unchanged. The first time it appeared after everything had unfolded, I felt my hand freeze in midair. I had been stirring soup, letting it simmer while the soft hum of the radio filled the room. I didn't answer. I didn't silence it either. I just watched the screen until the call faded and the light died out. It was strange how much power that little rectangle still held. Not the phone itself, but the name. He called again the next day, and then the next. Each time the message he left grew shorter, softer. He didn't beg, he didn't demand. He spoke in a tone I hadn't heard in years, not the rushed, distracted one of obligation, nor the strained politeness of duty. This was different. This was unfamiliar. Or maybe it was just old, buried under everything time had eroded. I saved the messages, not to replay them, but to remind myself that they had happened, that he was trying, that maybe in some distant corner of his conscience he had begun to see what I had endured. But I didn't answer. I couldn't, not yet. I wasn't ready to be pulled back into something I had worked so hard to release. I wasn't ready to give him the comfort of my voice when I had spent years craving the sound of his. Over the weeks, the frequency changed. Sometimes it was once a week, sometimes two. Holidays triggered more, birthdays, anniversaries. The calls never came with expectation anymore, just presence. A digital knock on the door that I didn't have to open. And then, one afternoon, I was in the grocery store when the name appeared again. I stood there, surrounded by oranges and cereal boxes, and felt the weight of that name settle differently. It didn't tighten my chest the way it used to. It didn't flood me with doubt or pain. It just sat there, quiet, steady. And I realized something. I had stopped needing the apology, not because I had forgotten what happened, not because I had forgiven, but because I had grown past the place where his recognition defined me. I had outgrown the need to be understood by someone who had never truly tried. And yet, there was still something human, something unfinished in the way my hand hovered over the screen. Still a part of me that wanted to know if anything had changed. I didn't answer that day either, but I smiled to myself as I put my phone back in my bag. Not a bitter smile, not smug, just the quiet understanding that I now had a choice. I could answer or not. I could return or remain still. And whichever I chose, I would not be losing anything. That was the power I had taken back. In the months that followed, I changed my voicemail. Just a simple message in my voice, warm but brief. A small reminder that I was still here, still living, still claiming my space. I added new contacts to my phone, people I met at the community center, a woman from the book club, a neighbor who shared lemon bars on Wednesdays. These names began to fill my recent calls list. Slowly, gently, they replaced the weight of his. I got postcards from places I had never been, invitations to birthday parties of children who weren't related to me, offers to volunteer at local events. My life expanded, not dramatically, not in bursts, but in soft, deliberate ripples. I became known in new spaces, not as someone's mother, not as someone's guest, but simply as Helen. One evening, as I sat on my small balcony with a cup of tea, the phone buzzed again. His name. I let it ring while I watched the sky deepen into violet. I thought about everything I had lost, but also everything I had found. And I realized I no longer felt like a woman cast out. I felt like a woman who had walked away and built something better. I didn't need to erase the past to live freely in the present. I just needed to make peace with it, to stop chasing explanations and start honoring my own voice. So I let the phone ring, and when it stopped, I took another sip of tea and looked at the sky again. The world was still turning. My life was still mine, and the name on the caller ID, once so heavy, was just a name, nothing more, nothing less.